The crimson sun hung low over the horizon, painting the rugged Montana territory in a tapestry of gold and amber as Mason Cole squinted against the dust kicked up by his horse's hooves. The year was 1878, and the trail back to his ranch stretched endlessly before him, another lonely ride after selling cattle in the nearest town. He adjusted his worn Stetson, the leather creased from years under the unforgiving western sun, when something unusual caught his eye: a small figure moving along the dirt road ahead, their gait uneven and labored. Mason slowed his chestnut stallion, Rusty, and peered through the settling dust. It was a woman, her dress torn and dirty, limping badly as she clutched her side. Without hesitation, he urged Rusty forward, closing the distance between them. "Madam," he called out, his voice rough from disuse. "Are you all right?" The woman turned, startled by his approach. Her face was streaked with dirt and what looked like dried tears, but even through the grime, Mason could see she was beautiful. Her eyes, a striking shade of green, widened with alarm. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to get to Silver Creek." "I don't suppose you could point me in the right direction." Mason dismounted, approaching her slowly, the way he might a spooked colt. "Silver Creek's still 15 miles north. You planning to walk all that way?" She attempted to straighten herself, wincing visibly. "If I must." Up close, he could see her ankle was swollen, her simple blue dress torn at the hem and stained with blood near her ribs. Her dark hair had mostly escaped its pins, falling in tangled waves around her shoulders. "What's your name?" Mason asked, keeping his distance, not wanting to frighten her further. "Josephine," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Josephine Winters." "I'm Mason Cole. I've got a ranch about 5 miles from here. Let me help you, Miss Winters." "That ankle won't carry you 15 more miles, and night's coming fast. Mountain lions get mighty curious after dark." Josephine glanced down the empty road, then back at him, clearly weighing her limited options. "How do I know I can trust you, Mr. Cole?" Mason removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair. "You don't, but I give you my word as a gentleman that I mean you no harm. My mother raised me better than that." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, quickly replaced by a grimace as she shifted her weight. "I don't have much choice, do I?" "Everyone's got choices," Mason replied, replacing his hat. "But some are wiser than others." Before she could respond, Josephine attempted to take another step and nearly collapsed. Mason moved quickly, catching her before she hit the ground. She felt small in his arms, but there was a strength in the way she gripped his shirt, fighting to stay conscious. "I'm going to lift you onto my horse," he said, his voice gentler than before. "We need to see to those injuries." Too weak to protest, Josephine nodded. With careful movements, Mason lifted her into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel her trembling, though whether from pain or fear he couldn't tell. He carried her to Rusty, who stood patiently waiting. "I'll need to sit behind you," Mason explained. "To make sure you don't fall." Josephine hesitated, then nodded again. "Thank you, Mr. Cole." With practiced ease, Mason mounted the horse with Josephine in his arms, settling her in front of him. He could feel her tense as his arms encircled her to grip the reins, but she said nothing. "It's about an hour's ride," he told her. "Try to rest if you can." As they rode, the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the plains. Mason kept Rusty at a steady pace, mindful of his passenger's injuries. Occasionally, he felt Josephine lean more heavily against him, her breathing growing more even as exhaustion overtook her. "May I ask what happened?" he ventured after they'd ridden in silence for some time. Josephine stiffened in his arms. "I'd rather not discuss it just yet, if you don't mind." Mason nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Fair enough. We've all got stories we're not ready to tell." They lapsed back into silence, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats of Rusty and the occasional call of a hawk overhead. Mason found himself acutely aware of the woman in his arms, the faint scent of lavender that somehow lingered beneath the dust and sweat, the curve of her shoulder against his chest, the quiet determination that seemed to radiate from her despite her injuries. As they crested a hill, Mason's ranch came into view, a modest but well-maintained house with a large barn and several corrals. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that his ranch hand, Old Joe, had likely started supper. "There it is," Mason said, nodding toward the buildings. Not much, but it's home. Josephine stirred, having dozed off during the ride. It looks wonderful, she murmured, and Mason couldn't help but smile at the sincerity in her voice. As they approached the house, the front door opened, and old Joe stepped out, his weathered face creasing with concern as he spotted the extra rider. "Joe," Mason called out as they reached the yard. "We've got a guest who needs some tending to." The older man hurried forward as Mason carefully dismounted, then reached up to help Josephine down. When her feet touched the ground, she stumbled, her injured ankle giving way. Without hesitation, Mason swept her into his arms again. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "Not on that ankle, you can't," Mason replied, already carrying her toward the house. "Joe, could you see to Rusty?" "Course." The older man nodded, taking the reins. His eyes lingered on Josephine with open curiosity before he led the horse away. Mason carried Josephine into the house, the warmth from the fireplace a welcome change from the cooling evening air. The main room was simply furnished but clean, with a large hearth, a sturdy table with chairs, and a pair of comfortable-looking armchairs. "I'll put you in my room for now," Mason said, moving toward a door on the right. "It's the only proper bedroom besides Joe's." "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will," Mason interrupted firmly. "I'll take the spare cot in the barn. It wouldn't be the first time." The bedroom was as modest as the rest of the house, a bed with a handmade quilt, a chest of drawers, a small table with a basin and pitcher. Mason gently laid Josephine on the bed, careful not to jostle her injuries. "I'll fetch some water and bandages," he said, straightening. Joe's wife was a healer before she passed, left us well stocked with remedies. Josephine caught his hand as he turned to leave, surprising them both. "Thank you," she said, her green eyes meeting his. "Truly?" Mason nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. He cleared his throat. "Rest. I'll be back soon." When he returned with warm water, clean cloths, and a box of medicinal supplies, Josephine had managed to remove her boots, revealing an ankle swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Mason set the items on the bedside table, then hesitated. "I should fetch you something clean to wear," he said, moving to the chest of drawers. He pulled out a worn but clean shirt. "It's not much, but it'll be more comfortable than that dress." Josephine accepted the shirt with a small smile. "You're very kind, Mr. Cole." "Mason," he corrected. "Mr. Cole was my father." "Mason," she repeated softly. "Then you must call me Josephine." He nodded, then gestured to her ankle. "May I?" At her consent, Mason gently examined her injury, his calloused hands surprisingly tender. "Not broken, I don't think, but a bad sprain for sure. We'll wrap it tight and keep it elevated." He glanced at her side where the blood had stained her dress. "And that?" Josephine's hand went to her ribs. "Just a cut. It looks worse than it is." Mason raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I'll step out while you change. Call when you're ready and I'll help with that bandage." Outside the room, Mason leaned against the wall, running a hand through his hair. What was he doing? Bringing a strange woman into his home. He knew nothing about her or what trouble might be following her. Yet something in her eyes, a mixture of fear, determination, and something else he couldn't quite name, had compelled him to help. "Mason." Josephine's voice called softly from the other side of the door. He entered to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, his shirt hanging loosely on her frame. She'd managed to clean most of the dirt from her face, and her dark hair was pulled back in a loose braid. The sight of her in his clothing stirred something unexpected in Mason's chest. "Let me see that cut," he said, focusing on the task at hand. Josephine hesitated, then carefully lifted the edge of the shirt to reveal a nasty gash along her ribs. Mason winced in sympathy. "This needs stitching," he said, reaching for the box of supplies. "I'm no doctor, but I've patched up my share of injuries." "I trust you," Josephine said simply, and the weight of those 3 words settled heavily between them. Mason worked carefully, cleaning the wound and stitching it closed with neat, even sutures. Josephine remained silent throughout, only the occasional sharp intake of breath betraying her pain. "There," he said finally, applying a clean bandage. "Keep it dry and it should heal without too much scarring." He moved onto her ankle, wrapping it tightly with strips of cloth. As he worked, he found himself wanting to know more about this woman who had appeared so unexpectedly on the road. "Are you from Silver Creek?" he asked, keeping his tone conversational. Josephine watched his hands as they worked. "No, I was heading there to meet someone." "Family?" A shadow passed over her face. "An old friend, she's expecting me." Mason sensed there was more to the story but didn't press. "Well, you can rest here until you're well enough to travel. I'll send word to your friend that you're safe." "That's very generous," Josephine said, her voice tinged with relief. "I can't pay you, but I could help around the house while I'm here." Mason finished wrapping her ankle and sat back. "No need, just focus on healing." He stood, gathering the supplies. "You must be hungry. I'll see what Joe's got cooking." Supper that night was a simple affair: beef stew and cornbread, but Josephine ate as if it were a feast, having refused Mason's offer to bring a tray to her room, and insisted on joining them at the table instead. Old Joe, initially quiet and watchful, gradually warmed to her presence, especially when she complimented his cooking. "Been feeding this one for 5 years, Joe said, nodding toward Mason. "About time someone appreciated my efforts." Mason rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "I appreciate not starving." Josephine laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to transform her face. Mason found himself staring, captivated by the change. After the meal, despite her protests, Mason carried Josephine back to the bedroom. "You need rest," he insisted. "Doctor's orders." "I wasn't aware you had a medical degree," she teased, but her eyes were already heavy with exhaustion. "Good night, Josephine," Mason said softly, turning to leave. "Mason," she called as he reached the door. When he turned back, she was watching him with an unreadable expression. "Thank you." "For everything." He nodded once, then closed the door behind him, wondering what strange twist of fate had brought Josephine Winters into his life, and why he couldn't shake the feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. The following morning, Mason woke at dawn as usual, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the house to the barn where he'd spent the night on a narrow cot. His back protested as he stood, but he ignored it, dressing quickly in the cool morning air. He'd slept poorly, his thoughts continually drifting to the mysterious woman occupying his bedroom. Inside the house, he found old Joe at the stove, and to his surprise, Josephine seated at the table, her injured leg propped on a chair. She wore the same shirt he'd given her the night before, now paired with a belt that cinched it at her waist, giving it the appearance of a very short dress. "Morning," she greeted him with a small smile. "Your friend was kind enough to help me to the table. I hope you don't mind." Mason glanced at Joe, who shrugged unapologetically. "The lady was determined," the older man said. "You should be resting," Mason admonished, pouring himself a cup of coffee. Josephine's chin lifted slightly. "I've never been one for lying about. Besides, I feel much better today." Mason doubted this was entirely true, given the shadows under her eyes and the way she held herself carefully, as if to avoid aggravating her injuries. But there was a stubbornness in her expression that told him arguing would be futile. "At least stay off that ankle," he conceded, taking a seat across from her. "I can ride into town today and send word to your friend in Silver Creek." Something flickered in Josephine's eyes, alarm, perhaps, before she composed herself. "That's very kind, but I wouldn't want to trouble you." "No trouble," Mason assured her. "I need supplies anyway. What's your friend's name?" "Martha Jenkins," Josephine replied after a brief hesitation. "She runs the boarding house on Main Street." Mason nodded, making a mental note. "I'll let her know you're safe and will be along when you're healed." Josephine seemed about to say something more, but was interrupted by Joe setting plates of bacon, eggs, and biscuits before them. "Eat up," the old ranch hand instructed. "Nothing heals a body like good food." After breakfast, Mason prepared to ride into town, leaving old Joe with strict instructions to ensure Josephine stayed off her feet. She watched from the porch as he saddled Rusty, her expression thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Mason asked as he tightened the cinch. Josephine hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Be careful in town," she said, "if anyone asks about me." Mason waited, but she didn't continue. "Should I be expecting trouble?" he asked quietly. She looked away, her hands twisting in the fabric of his borrowed shirt. "I hope not. But it might be best if you didn't mention me specifically." Mason finished with the saddle and approached the porch, stopping a respectful distance away. "Josephine, if you're in some kind of danger, I need to know, not just for my sake, but for Joe's too." She met his gaze, and the vulnerability in her eyes made his chest tighten. I'm not a criminal, if that's what you're asking, but I am, running from something, someone. I didn't plan to involve anyone else. Well, you're involved now, Mason said simply. When I get back, we can talk more. If you want to. She nodded, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warmth of the morning sun. Thank you. The ride to town took nearly 2 hours, giving Mason plenty of time to wonder about Josephine's cryptic warning. He'd met his share of people on the run in his years out west, most with good reason. The frontier had a way of attracting those seeking a fresh start, himself included. Whatever Josephine was running from, he found himself increasingly determined to help her. Granite Springs was a small but growing town, boasting a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a recently established bank. Mason tied Rusty at the hitching post outside the general store and entered, nodding to the proprietor, Harold Wilson. Mason Cole, Harold greeted him warmly. Didn't expect to see you for another week at least. Running low on some essentials, Mason explained, beginning to gather supplies: coffee, flour, sugar, and a few other items. After a moment's consideration, he added a bar of lavender soap to his purchases, thinking Josephine might appreciate it. As Harold tallied his items, the storekeeper leaned forward conspiratorially. Heard there was some excitement over in Silver Creek yesterday. Sheriff, there's looking for a woman who supposedly stole some valuable items from one of the big mining investors. Mason kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. That's so, Harold nodded eagerly. Sent telegrams to all the surrounding towns. Dark-haired woman traveling alone. Apparently she worked as the man's housekeeper until she up and disappeared with a fortune in jewelry and cash. People aren't always what they seem, Mason commented, counting out money for his purchases. True enough, Harold agreed. Say, I don't suppose you've seen any strangers on the road lately. Sheriff's offering a reward. Mason shook his head. Just the usual traffic. Quiet as always on my stretch. The lie came easily, surprising him. He wasn't ordinarily one to deceive, but something about the story felt wrong. He couldn't reconcile the frightened, injured woman he'd rescued with a cold-hearted thief. After leaving the store, Mason made his way to the telegraph office. He considered his promise to contact Josephine's friend in Silver Creek, but decided against it for now. If there was trouble brewing there, he didn't want to inadvertently lead it to his door or to Josephine. Instead, he drafted a message to an old friend, Michael Reeves, who served as a deputy in Silver Creek. The telegram was brief. Heard rumors of theft, details appreciated. M. Cole, his business in town concluded. Mason mounted Rusty for the ride home, his mind heavy with questions. Was Josephine the woman they were looking for? And if so, was she truly guilty of theft, or was there more to the story? The sun was high overhead when Mason finally turned onto the long drive leading to his ranch. As the house came into view, he spotted Josephine sitting on the porch, her injured leg propped up on a stool, a book in her hands. The sight of her waiting there, looking almost as if she belonged, stirred something in him that he quickly tamped down. She was a guest and possibly a fugitive, nothing more. Josephine looked up as he approached, shading her eyes against the sun. Her hair was loose today, falling in dark waves around her shoulders, and Mason found it difficult to look away. You're back earlier than expected, she called as he dismounted. Didn't see the need to linger, he replied, leading Rusty toward the barn. Joe around, checking on a calf in the north pasture, she answered. He said not to worry, he'd be back by supper. Mason nodded, disappearing into the barn to unsaddle and brush down his horse. When he emerged, supplies in hand, Josephine was watching him with a cautious expression. Did you send word to Martha? She asked as he climbed the porch steps. Mason set the supplies down and met her gaze directly. No, he admitted. There seems to be some commotion in Silver Creek at the moment, something about a theft. Josephine's face paled and she closed the book in her lap with trembling hands. I see. Is there something you want to tell me, Josephine? Mason asked quietly, taking a seat on the porch, railing opposite her. She was silent for a long moment, her eyes downcast. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. He'll say I stole from him, that I'm a thief and a liar. And did you? Her head snapped up, green eyes flashing. No, I took nothing that wasn't rightfully mine. Mason studied her, looking for any sign of deception. Then why run? Josephine laughed bitterly. Because James Morgan is the richest man in Silver Creek and his word is law. No one would believe me over him. I might, Mason said simply. Something in his tone made Josephine pause. She searched his face, then seemed to come to a decision. I was employed as Mr. Morgan's housekeeper for nearly a year. He's a widower, well respected in town. What no one sees is what happens behind closed doors. She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He began to pay me special attention, unwanted attention. At first it was just comments, looks, then touches. I made it clear I wasn't interested, but he persisted. Said I owed him for giving me employment, for putting a roof over my head. Mason's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. 3 days ago, he cornered me in the kitchen, said he was tired of my teasing and that it was time I showed proper gratitude. When I refused him, he became violent. Her hand unconsciously went to her side, where the cut lay bandaged beneath her borrowed shirt. I managed to fight him off and ran. On my way out, I took the locket that had belonged to my mother, the one he'd confiscated when I first arrived, claiming servants shouldn't own such valuables. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. This is what he'll claim I stole. Along with whatever else he thinks will make me sound more villainous. Mason absorbed her story, anger building inside him at the thought of what she'd endured. And the friend in Silver Creek, Martha, Josephine shook her head. There is no Martha, I made her up. I was heading to Silver Creek because it's the last place Morgan would expect me to go right back to town. I thought I could hide there until I figured out my next move. Why not go to the sheriff? With what proof? Josephine asked bitterly. My word against his. Morgan owns half the businesses in Silver Creek, including the bank where the sheriff keeps his savings. No, there would be no justice for me there. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant lowing of cattle and the soft breeze rustling through the grass. You could stay here, Mason finally said, surprising himself almost as much as Josephine, whose eyes widened. At least until we figure something out, you'd be safe. Why would you do that? She asked, genuine confusion in her voice. You don't know me, I could be lying. Mason stood, picking up the supplies he'd set down. I like to think I'm a decent judge of character, and nobody who's faking an injury would have endured my stitching without screaming. He offered a small smile, which she hesitantly returned. Besides, old Joe seems to like you, and he doesn't like anybody. I can't stay forever, Josephine said softly. Morgan won't give up easily. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Mason replied. For now, focus on healing. He reached into the bag of supplies and pulled out the bar of lavender soap, holding it out to her. Thought you might like this. Josephine accepted the soap, her fingers brushing his in the process. The contact, brief as it was, sent an unexpected warmth through Mason's hand. Thank you, she said, her eyes meeting his with a softness that hadn't been there before. For everything. Mason nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. He cleared his throat. I should get these supplies inside. As he turned to go, Josephine called after him. Mason. When he looked back, she was smiling a genuine smile that transformed her face and made his heart beat a little faster. I'm glad it was you who found me on that road. So am I, he replied honestly, before disappearing into the house, wondering what exactly he was getting himself into and why, despite the potential danger, it felt so right. Over the next few days, a routine developed at the Cole Ranch. Josephine's ankle improved steadily, allowing her to move around the house with the aid of a walking stick Mason had carved for her. True to her word, she insisted on helping with household tasks, taking over the cooking from old Joe, much to everyone's relief, and keeping the house tidier than it had been in years. Mason found himself looking forward to returning to the house after a day's work, drawn by the warm light in the windows and the knowledge that Josephine would be waiting with a meal and conversation. They spent evenings by the fire, talking long after old Joe had retired to his room. Mason told her about his childhood in Missouri, his decision to head west after the war, and the years of hard work that had gone into building his modest ranch. In turn, Josephine shared stories of her life before Silver Creek, growing up the daughter of a schoolteacher in Ohio, losing both parents to influenza, and making her way west in search of opportunity. What neither of them acknowledged was the growing tension between them, the lingering glances, the way their hands would occasionally brush as they passed items at the table, the comfortable silences that seemed charged with unspoken feelings. On the 5th day after Josephine's arrival, Mason received a telegram from his friend in Silver Creek. He read it while still in town, his expression darkening with each word. Morgan pressing theft charges, $500 missing plus jewelry, offering $100 reward. Description matches your inquiry. Suspect heading north. Morgan reputation questionable. Proceed with caution. M. Reeves. The amount was a fabrication. Mason was certain of that now, but it made Josephine's situation more precarious. A reward that size would have every bounty hunter and opportunist in the territory looking for her. He returned to the ranch earlier than usual, finding Josephine in the garden behind the house, hanging laundry on the line. She wore one of his old shirts tucked into a pair of trousers that Joe had altered for her hair braided down her back. The sight of her performing such a domestic task, looking so at home on his property, made Mason pause, a strange longing filling his chest. She turned as if sensing his presence, a smile spreading across her face. "You're back early. Is everything all right?" Mason approached, the telegram heavy in his pocket. "I heard from my friend in Silver Creek." Josephine's smile faded, her hand stilling on the wet shirt she'd been about to hang. "And Morgan's claiming you took $500 in cash along with jewelry. He's offering a reward." She paled, her knuckles whitening around the damp fabric. "I took nothing but my locket, not a single coin." She looked up at him, eyes searching his face. "You believe me, don't you?" "I do," Mason assured her, stepping closer, "but it complicates things. With that kind of reward, people will be looking for you." Josephine turned away, hanging the shirt with shaking hands. "I should leave. I'm putting you and Joe in danger by staying here." "And go where?" Mason asked. "Alone, injured, with no money and a bounty on your head." "That's not a solution, Josephine." "I can't stay here forever," she insisted, though there was a note of despair in her voice. "Not forever," Mason agreed. "Just until we figure out how to clear your name." Josephine turned to face him, her expression incredulous. "Clear my name?" "Against a man like Morgan, that's impossible." "Nothing's impossible," Mason said firmly. "My friend Michael is a deputy in Silver Creek. He mentioned that Morgan's reputation is questionable. That means others might have had experiences similar to yours. Even if that's true, who would speak against him? He holds too much power." Mason considered this. "Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up. Others might follow." Josephine shook her head, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You make it sound so simple." "Simple? No. Possible? Yes." Mason reached out, hesitating only briefly before taking her hand. Her skin was cool and damp from the laundry, but she didn't pull away. "You don't have to face this alone, Josephine." Something shifted in her expression, surprise, followed by a softening that made Mason's heart beat faster. "Why are you doing this for me?" she asked quietly. "Taking such a risk for someone you barely know?" Mason looked down at their joined hands, trying to find the right words. "I've spent most of my life out here, keeping to myself, building something that's mine. It's a good life, but it's quiet. Then you appeared on that road, and suddenly everything feels different, more alive somehow." He met her gaze again. "I can't explain it better than that." Josephine's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I thought my life was over when I ran from Morgan's house, that I'd never feel safe again." Her fingers tightened around his. "I didn't expect to find safety with a stranger, or whatever this is becoming." The air between them seemed to still, the only sound the soft flapping of damp clothes on the line and the distant lowing of cattle. Mason found himself leaning closer, drawn by something he couldn't name, and Josephine tilted her face up toward his. The moment was shattered by old Joe's voice calling from the barn. "Mason, got a visitor coming up the road." They broke apart, both turning toward the sound. Mason's hand went instinctively to the revolver at his hip. "Get inside," he told Josephine, his voice low and urgent. "Stay out of sight until I see who it is." She nodded, gathering the remaining laundry quickly before hurrying toward the house. Mason strode to the front of the property, where Joe was already waiting, shotgun in hand. A single rider approached at a leisurely pace, the dust kicked up by his horse visible long before the man himself. As he drew closer, Mason recognized the distinctive hat and posture of Sheriff William Tanner from Granite Springs. "It's Tanner," Mason informed Joe, relaxing slightly but not entirely. "The sheriff wasn't known for making social calls. Want me to make myself scarce?" Joe asked, nodding toward the house where Josephine was hidden. Mason shook his head. "No need to act suspicious, just follow my lead." Sheriff Tanner reined in his horse as he reached them, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "Afternoon, Mason." "Joe." "Sheriff," Mason replied evenly. "What brings you all the way out here?" Tanner dismounted, his weathered face unreadable. "Just making my rounds. Checking in with the outlying properties." He glanced around the yard, his gaze lingering on the house. "Heard there was some trouble over in Silver Creek. Thought I'd spread the word to keep an eye out for strangers." "That's so." Mason kept his tone casual. "What kind of trouble?" "Theft," Tanner said, his eyes returning to Mason's face. "Young woman took advantage of her employer's trust. Dark hair, green eyes, slight build. Might be injured. Sound familiar?" Mason met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Can't say it does. Haven't seen anyone matching that description." Tanner nodded slowly, clearly unconvinced. "Mind if I water my horse? Been a long ride." "Help yourself," Mason gestured toward the water trough. "Coffee's hot inside if you're interested." "Obliged," Tanner said, leading his horse to the trough. "Might take you up on that coffee." As the sheriff turned away, Mason exchanged a quick glance with Joe, who nodded almost imperceptibly before heading toward the barn. Mason knew the old ranch hand would find a way to warn Josephine if she hadn't already hidden herself. Inside the house, Mason poured 2 cups of coffee, his mind racing. Tanner was no fool he hadn't ridden all this way on a routine patrol. Someone must have seen Josephine, or perhaps the sheriff was simply checking every isolated property in his jurisdiction. Sheriff Tanner entered a moment later, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail. "Nice place you've got," he commented, accepting the offered coffee. "Keep it tidy," Mason shrugged. "Do what we can." Tanner took a seat at the table, gesturing for Mason to join him. "Known you a long time, Mason. Always found you to be an honest man." "I appreciate that," Mason replied, sitting across from the sheriff. "Which is why I'm going to be direct with you," Tanner continued, his voice hardening slightly. "Word around town is you were asking questions about Silver Creek. Same day you came in for supplies when you weren't due for another week. Now, that could be coincidence. Or it could be my business," Mason finished for him, keeping his tone respectful but firm. Tanner sipped his coffee, regarding Mason over the rim of the cup. "When it involves a fugitive from justice, it becomes my business." The tension in the room thickened. Mason considered his options carefully before speaking. "What if the so-called victim isn't telling the whole truth?" Tanner's eyebrows rose. "You saying you know something about this case?" "I'm saying that sometimes powerful men can make accusations that aren't questioned as thoroughly as they should be," Mason replied. The sheriff set down his cup, his expression thoughtful. "You're not wrong about that, but the law is the law, Mason. If you're harboring a fugitive—" "I never said I was," Mason interrupted. "Then you're putting yourself in a difficult position," Tanner finished, ignoring the interruption. "One I'd hate to see you in." They stared at each other across the table, the silence stretching between them. Finally, Tanner sighed and stood. "I've said my piece," he declared, placing his hat back on his head. "Whatever you decide to do next is up to you, but consider this a friendly warning. This situation could get messy fast." Mason rose as well, escorting the sheriff to the door. "I appreciate your concern." At the threshold, Tanner paused. "One more thing. Morgan's sending men to search the area. They don't have the legal authority that I do, and they might not be as civil. Watch yourself, Mason." With that, the sheriff departed, mounting his horse and riding away without looking back. Mason watched until he disappeared from view, then turned to find Josephine standing in the bedroom doorway, her face ashen. "He knows I'm here," she said, her voice barely audible. "He suspects," Mason corrected, "but he didn't search the place, which means he's not certain." Or he's giving you a chance to turn me in yourself, Josephine countered. Mason moved toward her, gently taking her by the shoulders. That's not going to happen, but we need to be prepared. If Morgan's sending men, things could get dangerous. Josephine's eyes filled with tears. I never meant to bring this to your door. I should leave tonight, try to get further north. No, Mason said firmly. Running now would be the worst thing you could do. We need a plan, not a panic. Just then, old Joe burst through the front door, his weathered face grim. Riders coming, 6 of them, moving fast, and they ain't looking friendly. Mason's mind raced. 6 men was more than he'd anticipated, and sooner too. They must have already been nearby when Tanner visited. Joe, get the rifles from the gun cabinet. Josephine, go to the root cellar. The entrance is hidden under the rug in the pantry. Stay there until one of us comes for you. I won't hide while you risk your lives for me, Josephine protested. Mason cupped her face in his hands, the urgency of the moment stripping away his usual reserve. Please, I can't protect you and fight them at the same time. I need to know you're safe. Something in his eyes must have convinced her, for she nodded reluctantly. Be careful, she whispered, her hand briefly covering his before she hurried toward the pantry. Joe returned with the rifles, handing one to Mason. What's the plan? We try to talk first, Mason said, checking that his weapon was loaded. Maybe they just want to search the place. And if they want more than that? Joe asked grimly. Mason's expression hardened. Then they'll find out this isn't the day to test my hospitality. They positioned themselves on the porch, rifles visible but not aimed as the riders approached. Mason recognized the lead rider immediately, Sam Wilson, a known hired gun who'd worked as Morgan's enforcer in Silver Creek for years. The men with him had the hard-eyed look of those who fought for money rather than principle. Cole, Wilson called as they reined in before the house. Heard you might be entertaining a guest. One Mr. Morgan is mighty interested in finding. You're mistaken, Mason replied coolly. Now state your business or move on. You're trespassing on private property. Wilson smirked, an ugly expression on his pockmarked face. Now that's not very neighborly. We just want to have a look around. Make sure you're not harboring a dangerous criminal. Sheriff Tanner was already here, Mason informed them. He found nothing of interest. His authority I respect, yours I don't. The men exchanged glances, clearly not having expected this information. Wilson's smirk faltered briefly before returning with a harder edge. Tanner's got his jurisdiction and I've got my orders, he said, dismounting. The others followed suit. We're coming in, Cole. Only question is whether you make it easy or difficult. Mason raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but a clear warning. This is still my property, Wilson. You take one more step toward this house without my permission, and I'll consider it an act of aggression. Wilson's hand moved to the revolver at his hip. 6 against 2 ain't good odds, Cole. Be reasonable. I'm being perfectly reasonable, Mason replied, his voice steady despite the tension coiling inside him. You're the ones threatening armed trespass. For a long moment, no one moved. The air seemed to thicken with the possibility of violence, the only sound the nervous shifting of horses and the creak of leather as hands hovered near weapons. The standoff was broken by the unexpected sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. All eyes turned to see Sheriff Tanner returning, this time accompanied by 2 deputies. The sheriff's expression was thunderous as he surveyed the scene before him. What in the hell is going on here? Tanner demanded, his gaze fixed on Wilson and his men. Wilson straightened, clearly caught off guard by the sheriff's return. Just having a conversation with Cole here. Nothing that concerns you, Sheriff. 6 armed men confronting citizens in my jurisdiction concerns me greatly, Tanner replied coldly. Especially when I gave explicit instructions that any investigation was to be conducted by my office alone. We have orders from Mr. Morgan. Mr. Morgan has no authority here, Tanner cut him off. Now, you and your men are going to mount up and ride back to Silver Creek. Tell Morgan if he wants to pursue this matter, he can do it through proper legal channels. Wilson hesitated, glancing at his companions before returning his attention to the sheriff. This isn't over, Tanner. Morgan won't be happy. That's Sheriff Tanner to you, came the sharp reply. And Morgan's happiness isn't my concern, justice is. With clear reluctance, Wilson and his men remounted their horses. "We'll be back, Cole," Wilson called as they prepared to depart, "with papers that even the sheriff can't ignore." "I look forward to seeing them," Mason replied evenly. They watched as the 6 riders departed, waiting until they were well out of sight before lowering their weapons. Mason turned to Sheriff Tanner, his expression questioning. "Thought you might need some backup," Tanner explained, dismounting. "Those men were already on the road when I left. Didn't like the look of them, so I gathered my deputies and circled back." "I appreciate the assistance," Mason said sincerely, "though I'm curious about your change of heart." Tanner shrugged. "Never said I was taking Morgan's side. Just wanted to know if you were harboring his missing housekeeper." His eyes narrowed. "Which, based on Wilson's presence here, I'm guessing you are." Mason didn't immediately respond, weighing his words carefully. "Sheriff," a new voice called, and all heads turned to see Josephine standing in the doorway of the house. She had ignored Mason's instructions to hide, apparently having decided to face the situation head-on. "I'm Josephine Winters, the woman James Morgan is looking for." Mason moved to her side, silently offering his support as she stepped onto the porch, her chin held high despite the fear visible in her eyes. "Miss Winters," Tanner acknowledged, studying her carefully, "you're accused of some serious crimes." "All false," Josephine replied steadily. "I took nothing but what was mine to begin with, this locket that belonged to my mother." She touched the gold pendant at her throat. "The rest is a fabrication designed to punish me for rejecting Mr. Morgan's advances and fleeing his house." Tanner's expression remained neutral, though something flickered in his eyes at her words. "That's a serious accusation against a prominent citizen." "It's the truth," Josephine insisted, "and I'm willing to testify to it before any judge." The sheriff removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair. "Truth's often harder to prove than lies, especially against a man with Morgan's influence." "Sheriff," Mason interjected, "is it possible there have been other complaints about Morgan's behavior? Other women who might have had similar experiences?" Tanner's gaze shifted to Mason, something like respect appearing in his weathered features. "As a matter of fact, there have been rumors. Nothing official. Most women in Morgan's employ don't stay long enough to file complaints, and those who do tend to find themselves facing countercharges or suddenly leaving town." "Then perhaps it's time someone stood their ground," Josephine said, her voice gaining strength. "I have nothing left to lose." The sheriff regarded her thoughtfully. "Maybe not nothing," he said, glancing between her and Mason with knowing eyes. He replaced his hat, coming to some internal decision. "I can't ignore an official complaint from Silver Creek. But neither can I allow armed men to terrorize citizens in my jurisdiction." "What are you suggesting?" Mason asked. "A compromise," Tanner replied. "Miss Winters turns herself in to me, not to Morgan's men. She'll be held in Granite Springs until a circuit judge arrives next week. She tells her story, Morgan tells his, and the judge decides who to believe. And in the meantime, she sits in a cell," Mason objected. "In protective custody," Tanner corrected. "Where Morgan's men can't get to her, it's the best I can offer within the law." Josephine placed a restraining hand on Mason's arm as he began to protest further. "It's a fair offer," she said quietly, "and perhaps the only way to resolve this permanently." Mason looked down at her, concern etched in his features. "You'd be alone. She'd be safe," Tanner assured him. "You have my word on that." Josephine's green eyes held Mason's, a newfound determination shining in them. "I need to stop running sometime. Better to face this on my own terms than be hunted forever." The logic was sound, but Mason found himself reluctant to let her go. In just a few short days, Josephine had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The thought of her in a cell, awaiting judgment, made his chest tighten painfully. "I'll be there," he promised her. "Every day. And I'll find others who might speak against Morgan. There must be someone who's witnessed his true nature." Josephine smiled, the expression both sad and resolute. "Thank you for believing in me. Not many would have." Sheriff Tanner cleared his throat. "If you're decided, we should go now, before Wilson and his men have time to regroup or send for reinforcements." Josephine nodded, then turned to Mason. "I need a moment to gather my things." As she disappeared into the house, Tanner stepped closer to Mason, speaking in a low voice. I meant what I said about protecting her, but Morgan has friends in high places. If you're serious about helping her, you'll need more than just your word against his. I understand, Mason replied grimly, and I'll find what we need. Inside the house, Mason found Josephine in his bedroom, carefully folding the clothes Joe had altered for her. Her movements were deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if giving herself time to accept her decision. You don't have to do this, Mason said from the doorway. We could find another way. Josephine turned to him, her expression softening. This is the right way, the honorable way. She approached him, stopping just a foot away. You've shown me what honor looks like, Mason Cole. Now I need to find my own. Unable to resist any longer, Mason reached out, drawing her into his arms. She came willingly, her body fitting against his as if made to be there. For a long moment, they simply held each other, the comfort of the embrace saying more than words could. I'll come for you, Mason murmured against her hair. As soon as this is over, whatever the outcome. Josephine pulled back slightly, looking up at him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. And if the outcome isn't in my favor, then we'll face that together too, he promised. You're not alone anymore, Josephine, not while I draw breath. She raised a hand to his cheek, her touch feather light. In all my life, I never expected to find someone like you, especially not on a dusty road when I thought all hope was lost. Mason covered her hand with his own, turning his face to press a kiss to her palm. Perhaps some things are meant to be, even in the most unlikely circumstances. Their eyes held, the moment stretching between them, filled with unspoken promises and newfound hope. Then, with visible reluctance, Josephine stepped back, gathering her meager belongings. I'm ready, she said, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her nervousness. Mason offered his arm, which she took with a grateful smile. Together, they walked out to where Sheriff Tanner and his deputies waited, heads held high, facing whatever lay ahead as they had from the moment Mason had first seen her limping down that dusty road together. The week that followed was the longest of Mason's life. True to his word, he visited Josephine every day in the small jailhouse in Granite Springs. Sheriff Tanner had made good on his promise, keeping her in a clean, separate cell away from the occasional drunks and troublemakers who found themselves temporarily incarcerated. He even allowed them to share meals in his office, offering what privacy he could under the circumstances. During those visits, Mason and Josephine grew closer, their conversations ranging from childhood memories to dreams for the future that seemed increasingly intertwined in both their minds, though neither quite dared to voice it directly. When not with Josephine, Mason threw himself into finding evidence that might help her case. He rode to neighboring towns, seeking out former employees of James Morgan, anyone who might have witnessed the man's true nature. Most doors closed in his face, fear of Morgan's influence stronger than any desire for justice. But not all. On the third day, he found Eliza Johnson, a former cook in Morgan's household who had left 6 months earlier. Initially reluctant to speak, she eventually revealed that she had witnessed Morgan's inappropriate behavior towards several young women in his employ. He's careful, she told Mason as they sat in her small kitchen. Always makes sure there's no witnesses when he goes too far. But I saw the aftermath, saw the girls crying, saw the bruises sometimes, heard him threaten them with ruin if they spoke out. Would you be willing to testify to that? Mason asked. Before a judge, Eliza hesitated, fear evident in her lined face. I got children, Mr. Cole, grandchildren. Morgan could make life mighty difficult for us. He could, Mason acknowledged. Or this could be the chance to ensure he never hurts another woman again. After long consideration, Eliza agreed, though the fear never quite left her eyes. The next breakthrough came unexpectedly from Michael Reeves, Mason's friend and deputy in Silver Creek. A telegram arrived on the 5th day. Found Morgan's former housekeeper, Sarah Benson, now in Denver. Similar story to JW, will testify by affidavit, sending by post, Mr. The affidavit arrived the day before the circuit judge was due in Granite Springs, a detailed account of Morgan's predatory behavior, his violent response when rejected, and his subsequent accusations of theft when Sarah fled. The pattern was identical to Josephine's experience, lending crucial credibility to her claims. Armed with this evidence, Mason visited Josephine with renewed hope. She read Sarah's affidavit with shaking hands, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not the only one," she whispered. "All this time I thought I was alone in what happened." Mason covered her hands with his. "You're not alone, not in this, not in anything, not anymore." Josephine looked up at him, something new and vulnerable in her expression. "When this is over, if I'm cleared." "When you're cleared," Mason corrected gently. She smiled, drawing strength from his certainty. "When I'm cleared, I don't know where I'll go. I have no home, no position." Mason took a deep breath, gathering his courage for words he'd been holding back all week. "You could stay, at the ranch." "With me?" Josephine's eyes widened. "As your housekeeper." "No," Mason said firmly. "Never that." He tightened his grip on her hands. "Josephine, I know it's been a short time, but I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you. When I found you on that road, something changed in me. Something I can't and don't want to change back." "Mason," she breathed, her voice catching on his name. "I'm not asking for promises," he continued quickly. "Just a chance for us to see if what we've found together could grow into something permanent." Tears filled Josephine's eyes again, but this time accompanied by a smile that transformed her entire face. "I thought it was just me," she confessed softly, "that I was foolish to feel so much so quickly." "Then we're both fools," Mason replied, his own smile breaking through. "And I find I don't mind that at all." Before either could say more, the jailhouse door opened and Sheriff Tanner entered, his expression serious. "Judge Harmon has arrived early," he announced. "He wants to hear Miss Winters' case immediately." And he added with a grim nod, "Morgan himself has ridden in with his lawyer." The momentary joy between Mason and Josephine faded, replaced by the gravity of what lay ahead. Mason stood, helping Josephine to her feet. "We're ready," he declared, though his heart pounded with apprehension. Judge Harmon conducted the hearing in the town hall, the largest building in Granite Springs. Despite the short notice, word had spread quickly, and the room was packed with curious townspeople. James Morgan sat at a table near the front, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, his lawyer beside him. The contrast with Josephine in her borrowed clothes could not have been more stark. Mason sat behind Josephine, unable to join her at the defendant's table, but close enough to offer silent support. Eliza Johnson sat nearby, her hands twisted nervously in her lap. Sheriff Tanner stood at the back, maintaining order as whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Harmon, a stern-faced man with piercing blue eyes, called the proceedings to order. "This is an informal hearing to determine whether charges brought by Mr. James Morgan against Miss Josephine Winters have sufficient merit to warrant a formal trial," he announced. "I will hear from both parties and any witnesses, then make my determination." Morgan spoke first, painting a picture of Josephine as a deceitful employee who had abused his trust, stolen valuable items, and fled to avoid consequences. He described the missing $500 and jewelry in detail, his voice ringing with righteous indignation. "She took advantage of my generosity," Morgan concluded, his handsome face the picture of wounded dignity. "I took her in when she had nowhere to go, gave her honest employment, and this is how she repaid me." When Josephine's turn came, she rose on still shaky legs, her head held high despite the fear Mason could see in the tension of her shoulders. "I took nothing that wasn't mine," she stated clearly. "The only item I left with was this locket, which belonged to my mother." She touched the gold pendant at her throat. "Mr. Morgan confiscated it when I entered his employ, claiming servants shouldn't own such things. As for the money and other jewelry, I never saw them, let alone took them." She took a deep breath before continuing. "What Mr. Morgan has not mentioned is why I fled his house in the middle of the night. He attempted to force himself on me, as he has done with other women in his employ. When I resisted, he became violent." She gestured to her side where the cut had healed but left a visible scar. "This was the result. I ran for my life, taking only what was rightfully mine." Murmurs swept through the crowd, growing louder until Judge Harmon rapped his gavel for silence. Morgan's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Your Honor, These are outrageous and unfounded accusations meant to distract from Miss Winters' crimes. Mr. Morgan is a respected businessman with an impeccable reputation. Is he? Judge Harmon inquired, his expression unreadable. Let us hear from the witnesses. Eliza Johnson spoke next, her voice initially tremulous but growing stronger as she recounted what she had witnessed in Morgan's household. As she described the pattern of harassment and intimidation, Morgan's face darkened with fury. She's lying, he interrupted. This is a conspiracy to defame me. You will have your turn to respond, Mr. Morgan, Judge Harmon admonished. For now, you will remain silent or be removed from these proceedings. Following Eliza's testimony, Sheriff Tanner presented Sarah Benson's affidavit, reading it aloud to the court. The similarities to Josephine's account were unmistakable, drawing more murmurs from the assembled townspeople. Morgan's rebuttal was passionate but increasingly desperate. He attacked the credibility of the witnesses, suggested a conspiracy orchestrated by business rivals, and repeatedly emphasized his standing in the community. His lawyer attempted to focus on the alleged theft, but Judge Harmon's penetrating questions repeatedly brought the discussion back to the pattern of behavior described by the witnesses. As the hearing stretched into its third hour, the atmosphere in the town hall grew increasingly tense. Mason watched Josephine, admiring her composure even as he longed to stand beside her, to physically shield her from Morgan's venomous glares. Finally, Judge Harmon called for closing statements. Morgan's lawyer delivered a polished speech about property rights and the importance of trusting established citizens over itinerant workers with questionable backgrounds. When Josephine rose for her final words, the room fell completely silent. I came west seeking honest work and a chance at a better life, she began, her voice clear and steady. What I found in Mr. Morgan's house was a nightmare I never anticipated. I don't expect justice for what he tried to do to me. Such justice is rare for women in my position. But I do ask that you recognize the truth of why I fled and what I took nothing more than what was already mine. She paused, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on Mason. Drawing strength from his presence, she continued, since leaving Mr. Morgan's house, I've discovered that kindness and honor still exist in this world. I've found people willing to stand up for truth, even at personal risk. Whatever you decide today, Your Honor, that discovery has given me hope I thought was lost forever. As Josephine returned to her seat, Mason felt a surge of pride so intense it was almost painful. Regardless of the outcome, she had faced her accuser with dignity and courage that few could match. Judge Harmon called for a recess to consider his decision. The crowd dispersed outside, forming small groups that buzzed with speculation. Morgan remained inside with his lawyer, while Sheriff Tanner escorted Josephine to a side room for privacy. Mason followed, determined not to leave her side during this crucial waiting period. You were magnificent, he told her once they were alone. No matter what happens next, remember that. Josephine managed a small smile, though tension lined her face. It feels good to finally speak the truth aloud, to name what happened. The judge seemed to be listening, Mason offered hopefully. Really listening, not just going through the motions. Before she could respond, the door opened and Sheriff Tanner entered. Judge is ready with his decision, he announced. It's time. The town hall refilled quickly, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. Judge Harmon took his seat, his expression giving no hint of his thoughts as he surveyed the assembled crowd. Having heard the testimony presented today, he began, his voice grave, I find no sufficient evidence to support the charge of theft against Miss Josephine Winters. The pattern of behavior described by multiple witnesses suggests a troubling abuse of power by Mr. Morgan and raises serious doubts about the veracity of his accusations. A ripple of reaction moved through the crowd. Morgan half rose from his seat, his face flushing dark with anger, but his lawyer pulled him back down. Miss Winters is free to go, Judge Harmon continued, with no charges to answer. Furthermore, he added, his gaze shifting to Morgan, I am recommending to the authorities in Silver Creek that they investigate Mr. Morgan's treatment of his female employees. If corroborating evidence is found to support today's testimony, more serious charges may be forthcoming. The judge rapped his gavel once, definitively. This hearing is concluded. For a moment, no one moved. Then the room erupted in a buzz of voices. Mason pushed through the crowd to reach Josephine, who stood motionless, as if unable to believe what she had heard. "It's over," he said, taking her hands in his. "You're free." Josephine's eyes filled with tears, a smile breaking through like sunshine after a storm. "Free," she repeated, the words sounding like a prayer. Their moment of celebration was interrupted by Morgan, who had shoved his way toward them, his handsome face contorted with rage. "This isn't finished," he spat, pointing a trembling finger at Josephine. "You think you've won." "I have friends everywhere. You'll never be safe." "That's enough, Morgan," Sheriff Tanner interjected, stepping between them. "Make another threat in my town, and you'll be spending the night in my jail." Morgan glared at the sheriff, then at Mason and Josephine, before turning on his heel and storming out, his lawyer hurrying after him. "He's just blustering," Tanner assured them, though his expression remained concerned. "But I'd advise caution all the same." "Men like that don't take defeat gracefully." Mason nodded, his arm instinctively moving around Josephine's shoulders. "We'll be careful." As they left the town hall, stepping into the late afternoon sunshine, Josephine paused, turning to face Mason. "Did you mean what you said?" "About me staying at the ranch. Every word," Mason replied without hesitation, "if that's what you want." "What I want," Josephine said slowly, as if testing the words, "is to stop running, to build something lasting, something real." Her eyes met his, vulnerable yet resolute. "With you, if you'll have me." Mason's heart swelled with an emotion too vast to name. Without caring who might be watching, he pulled Josephine into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world because to him she was. "I'll have you," he murmured against her hair. "For as long as you'll stay." Josephine leaned back slightly, her eyes searching his face. "That might be a very long time, Mason Cole." "I'm counting on it," he replied, and then, finally, he kissed her a gentle, reverent kiss that held all the promise of the future stretching before them. The journey back to the ranch that evening was filled with a quiet joy neither had expected to find in this life. Old Joe greeted them with gruff congratulations and a surprisingly good celebratory meal, having heard the news via the town's efficient grapevine. As they sat on the porch that night, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, Josephine's hand found Mason's, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I never thought I'd find a home again," she said softly. "After my parents died, I resigned myself to always being a visitor, never belonging anywhere." Mason squeezed her hand gently. "And now," she turned to him, her face luminous in the silver moonlight, "now I know home isn't always a place. Sometimes it's a person." Mason brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "Welcome home, Josephine." In the weeks that followed, they settled into a rhythm of shared work and growing intimacy. Josephine's ankle healed completely, allowing her to take on more responsibilities around the ranch. She proved to have a natural affinity for the garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the Montana soil with equal success. Inside the house, her touch transformed the simple rooms into a true home, filled with warmth and small, thoughtful details. Word came from Silver Creek that Morgan had left town abruptly, supposedly for business in San Francisco. Deputy Reeves wrote that an investigation had been opened into his treatment of employees, with several women coming forward now that the first stone had been cast. One clear autumn morning, 2 months after Josephine had first limped into Mason's life, he found her at the corral, watching as he broke a young colt. The animal was spirited but learning quickly, responding to Mason's patient handling with increasing trust. As Mason dismounted, wiping sweat from his brow, Josephine approached, offering a canteen of water. "He's coming along well," she observed, nodding toward the colt. "He's got heart," Mason agreed, taking a long drink. "Just needed someone to show him the way." Josephine smiled, understanding the parallel. "Sometimes we all do." Mason returned the canteen, then took her hand, leading her toward the shade of a large oak tree at the edge of the property. They sat beneath its spreading branches, looking out over the land that had become their shared home. "I've been thinking," Mason said after a comfortable silence. About the future. Josephine turned to him, her green eyes curious. What about it? Mason took both her hands in his, suddenly nervous despite having rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind. I know it hasn't been that long since you came here, and I understand if you need more time, but I can't imagine my life without you now, Josephine. Her expression softened, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. I can't imagine mine without you either. Encouraged, Mason continued, when I found you on that road, I never expected you'd change everything for me, but you have. You've made this place a home in ways it never was before. You've made me happier than I ever thought possible. He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small object that gleamed gold in the dappled sunlight, a simple ring with a single small diamond. It had been his mother's, sent west years ago by his sister after their mother's passing, with a note saying he should give it to the woman who captured his heart. Josephine Winters, Mason said, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Josephine's eyes filled with tears, her hands tightening around his. For a moment she seemed unable to speak, overwhelmed by emotion. Yes, she finally whispered, then more strongly, yes, Mason, with all my heart, yes. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Mason felt a sense of rightness so profound it took his breath away. He gathered Josephine into his arms, kissing her with all the love and promise he felt for their future together. Later that evening, they shared their news with old Joe, who pretended surprise for approximately 3 seconds before admitting he'd known Mason's intentions for weeks. About time, the old ranch hand declared gruffly, though his eyes shone with genuine happiness for them both. Never seen two people more meant to be together. They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Granite Springs, surrounded by the handful of people who had helped them find justice and a new beginning. Sheriff Tanner attended, as did Eliza Johnson and Michael Reeves, who had traveled from Silver Creek for the occasion. As Josephine walked toward him in a simple white dress, her dark hair adorned with wildflowers, Mason thought his heart might burst with joy. The woman who had limped into his life that fateful day now moved with confidence and grace, her green eyes shining with a love that matched his own. The ceremony was brief but deeply meaningful, their vows exchanged with voices steady and sure. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the small congregation erupted in cheers that seemed to fill the church beyond its capacity. Mrs. Cole, Mason murmured against Josephine's lips after their first kiss as a married couple. I like the sound of that, she replied, her smile radiant. Almost as much as I like the sound of forever. The years that followed brought changes to the Cole Ranch, a new, larger house built by Mason's own hands, with Josephine's input on every detail. Expanded herds that made the ranch increasingly prosperous. And most significantly, the arrival of children. First a daughter, Emma, with her father's thoughtful nature and her mother's striking green eyes, then twin boys, Daniel and Samuel, who brought equal measures of joy and chaos to the household. Through it all, Mason and Josephine's love deepened and matured, weathering the inevitable challenges of ranch life with a partnership forged in adversity and strengthened by choice. On difficult days, Mason would sometimes remind Josephine of their beginning, how he had seen her limping down that dusty road and carried her home. Best decision I ever made, he would say, drawing her close. For both of us, Josephine would reply, her heart full with the knowledge that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures if you're brave enough to follow the path they reveal. On their 10th anniversary, they stood together on the porch of their home, watching their children play in the yard as the Montana sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and amber, the same colors that had illuminated their first meeting. Mason's arm encircled Josephine's waist, holding her close against his side. Happy? He asked softly, though he knew the answer. Josephine turned her face up to his, the years having only enhanced her beauty in his eyes. More than I ever dreamed possible, she answered truthfully. As their lips met in a kiss that held all the tenderness of their shared history and all the promise of their future, Mason knew with absolute certainty that some journeys, no matter how they begin, lead exactly where we're meant to be. His had led him to Josephine, to this life they'd built together, to a love that had transformed them both, and he wouldn't change a single step along the way.